The session's agenda, we have a quick introduction, then we jump into the integration between Docker Desktop and Visual Studio Code, and we go into power user mode, and we'll wrap things up with demos and a recap. Let's start with the introduction. My name is Brian Christner. I am co-founder of 56k.cloud. We are a small DevOps boutique based in Switzerland, but mostly remote. We focus on cloud containers and automation, and we are now exploring also how we can bring the same developer experience to 5G. My background is in engineering and cloud architecture. I'm really passionate about open source and monitoring. I have a few GitHub repos you're more than happy to use because it's really starters to get up and running with monitoring. I've been a Docker captain since 2016, very proud of that. Traffic ambassador, and when I'm not behind the keyboard, I am on my mountain bike in the Swiss Alps. Before we get started, I really want to explain my discovery phase, or my story with Visual Studio Code, how I discovered Visual Studio Code. I was actually commuting on a train in Switzerland, and I was using Sublime Editor, and the person next to me said, you know, you'd really enjoy Visual Studio Code. I mean, random person. And I was like, okay, person. When I got home, the first thing I did was I was like, what is this Visual Studio Code? So I installed Visual Studio Code, and I was blown away. I mean, it solves all my problems. A, it works right out of the box. B, it solves my immediate problem, which is less context switching, because I'm always switching between multiple windows, terminals, Git, etc. So now Visual Studio Code, I have one screen, one window, one application, which solves all these problems. I can do my code linting, I can do my Git, my terminal, and with the marketplace and extensions, I can even take this further. So it solves a lot of my headaches I had previously. Now, don't take my word for it, but the Stack Overflow survey in 2019 actually says it's the most popular IDE available. So Stack Overflow survey, 50% of the respondents say they use Visual Studio Code. Now, this only gives props to Microsoft because, you know, they're building a nice ecosystem. It's open source. It really plays well with others, and it integrates into Docker Desktop, and the Docker extension brings it even further into the Docker ecosystem. The Visual Studio Code was actually launched in 2016. Shortly after, it just became very popular. I mean, as you see, it is now the de facto standard for code editors. Let's also quickly discuss the Docker extension. The Docker extension, believe it or not, only hit GA, general availability, back in March, 9th of March, and that means it is 1.0. Microsoft gives its stamp of approval that it's production ready and that it can go out in the field. With that said, that really means that Microsoft is confident it's a stable product and it's really ready for everyone. Let's quickly discuss Docker Desktop and Visual Studio Code. And like I previously mentioned, I'm more interested in the integrations between Docker Desktop and Visual Studio Code. If you start Docker Desktop and go to the dashboard, you see all the available containers that are running on your machine. So in my example here, I have a few containers, and the very bottom one, it's actually a Docker Compose stack. When I hover over it with my mouse, you can actually see buttons light up, open in Visual Studio Code. And what I did is I clicked on this, and it actually opens up the dashboard even further, showing me what containers are inside this Compose stack. And if I click the Open in Visual Studio Code button, it actually opens Visual Studio Code in the directory where the Compose file lives and all the application information. I don't have to go searching for it anymore. Again, this is the less context switching. I don't have to go from Visual Studio Code, open, navigate a bunch of folders. It just opens right there in the directory I want. I mean, this just helps tremendously. It increases productivity because it's less context switching. We can do the same thing for the command line. So the command line, we have the possibility to actually open Visual Studio Code directly from the directory we're in the command line. For example, you know, I have a project, I go code space minus dot, and it opens Visual Studio Code and all the code in that directory in Visual Studio Code. I mean, how cool is that? Now, out of the box, it works with Windows and Linux, but Mac OS, we're always special. So Shift Command P, and you can type shell command, install code command, and path. This allows you to put the code, Visual Studio Code, in your path, allows you to run this in the command line. All right, this brings us to Power User Mode. Power User Mode really gives us a lot of flexibility and a lot of streamlined commands to make our lives easier. Let's take a look at some of the possibilities. But before we go that way, Spider-Man's Uncle Ben Parker once said, with great power comes great responsibility. So we need to ensure that, what we're doing, it doesn't impact production, because now we can connect to multiple servers and different things with this Docker extension. Let's take a look what we can actually do with the Docker extension. First up, we can bootstrap new projects. And what I mean by that is, for example, a Python application. A simple Python application, no Docker file, no compose file. With Visual Studio Code, I can bootstrap this. Visual Studio Code then creates a Docker file and a compose file automatically for me, just based on what's in the directory. Really amazing. Next up, we can interact with containers, images, volumes, networks, and Docker hosts. So both through the Visual Studio Code command palette or through the UI, we can actually interact with containers. And we'll jump into the demo after. Next, we can write Dockerfiles with code completion. And it's not just code completion. You can actually look up images from Docker Hub and the tag directly from your code, which is really quite cool. Next up is build and debug. So again, after the bootstrap, it actually adds some debug code in there as well. So we can debug our containers directly from Visual Studio Code without any additional effort. And finally, we can connect to different Docker servers. Now, the Docker context command allows us to map Visual Studio Code to our local Docker host, to the cloud, to multiple servers, Docker and Docker. It really gives us the flexibility. So we can use the same Visual Studio Code interface, but connect to multiple Docker hosts. Really quite amazing. All right, how do I get started? It's easy as 1, 2, 3 to install the Docker extension. Now, bottom left, you can see it actually looks like containers. That's actually the Visual Studio Marketplace. If you click there first, it opens up another dialog box, and at the very top, number 2, you can type Docker. You can see the very top extension is the Docker extension we're looking for. It's actually made by Microsoft. If you click install, that's it. You're done. You have the Docker extension installed. Once we have the Docker extension installed, we can actually bootstrap a new project. In this example, we have a Python application actually written by a fellow Docker captain, Michael Irvin, and this is a random cat GIF generator. And as you see, there's no Docker file, no compose file. And we will use the Docker extension to actually enable the bootstrap. So it's going to ask us a couple of questions like, where is the application located? What port do you want to use? Do you want to add debug to the project? And that's it. And then it just creates all the files for us. We interact with the Docker extension in a couple of different ways. One is the command palette. In Mac OS is Shift-Command-P, or in Windows, Control-Shift-P. There, we can actually type Docker add, and you can see Docker add Dockerfiles to the workspace. And once you do that, it'll then trigger the questionnaire to generate the files. Additionally, if we want to interact with the Docker extension, if you click on the Docker logo, bottom left, number 1, you can see the Docker extension has its own UI. In this UI, we can interact with the containers. We can interact with containers, images, networks, volumes, and different Docker hosts. What's really great about this UI is we can do multiple selects. So we can select multiple containers, stop and start them, right-click, we can inspect, right-click, we can jump into the logs, or we can delete them. We can do that for all the containers, images, basically everything along this available in the UI. And this is really great. It's super fast for the workflow. I mean, right-click and you have it right away versus typing out a big command and looking for the Docker ID, etc. It allows you to quickly do tasks which before maybe took a little bit more time. And again, it's all within the same UI. All right, now we're ready for the demo, and in the demo we're going to demonstrate how to bootstrap and interact with Docker. So we're going to walk through the same screens we saw before. We're going to bootstrap a Python application, and then we're going to interact with this through the Visual Studio Code Docker extension. Switching over to my desktop, we can now see I have my terminal open, and here's the Python project, which I mentioned previously. Now in this directory, you can see I have a Python file called app.py, a requirements text, and a templates file, or a templates directory. So this is basically the directory I want to open in Visual Studio Code. To do that, I would type code space dot, and this will then execute Visual Studio Code to launch in that directory with all the files. Now we can see app.py requirements.txt index.html is all loaded directly in Visual Studio Code. This is quite handy. Now the next step, if you remember, we need to install the Docker extension. To do that, we head over here to the marketplace extensions, and it looks like a bunch of containers, to be honest, so it's easy to remember. So click the extensions, and we will type in Docker. And the first one in the list you can see is the official Microsoft Docker extension. We will click install, and it's installing, and we are now installed with the Docker extension. So there you go. When I click on the extension, I can instantly see what containers are available on my server, which images are there. I can connect to a registry, so let's connect to Docker Hub, and we go. And there you go. I am now connected to Docker Hub, and you can see here's my different users I have available and my different repos I have out in Docker Hub. And I actually can pull this image directly down from Docker Hub to my machine. I can open it in a browser, back out to Docker Hub. So it has a lot of flexibility. I can also connect to different registries like Azure or GitLab, for example. Now with the containers, which is quite interesting, which is also quite new, is the multi-select. So I can actually select all the containers and start them if I want. I can actually right-click or view logs. Let's just start up all these containers at once. So right-click, we're going to multi-select and start. You can see that easy, I just started 3 containers. They're not even in a stack together. You can see there's a traffic containers, 2 different traffic containers, and a home assistant, home automation suite. And again, I can then select them again, right-click, and stop. So we have successfully started and stopped multiple containers. Very easy to do with the multi-select. Additionally, we can right-click on any service here and view logs. And this executes the command directly in the terminal in Visual Studio Code. So Docker logs -f, it then takes the container ID and it shows you the logs within this particular container. We can also right-click and inspect. So now, just like we run the docker inspect command, you can see all the details about this container. So about the image, what kind of image it is, the volumes, the ports available, restart. I mean, it's very, very easy to do. We can also remove a container. So for example, I want to remove this one. It's exited. I'll remove it. And it is gone. And you see, it's super easy to navigate the different images, containers, and I'll go into here to a Redis. Here's a Redis image. It's no longer referenced. I can actually go in here and delete this as well. And we will remove that. And you can see there's multiple advantages or multiple possibilities to integrate or actually use the user interface within Docker extension UI. Now back to our project. You can then see how we can interface with the Docker UI. We also want to bootstrap a new project. And in order to bootstrap a new project, we are going to Apple Shift P, which brings up our command palette, and we are going to do docker add Dockerfiles to the workspace. And new, also within the newer version of 1.0, is they have multiple Python versions. So you can see there's Python Flask, Django, or General. So just a general app. So Microsoft has actually dedicated more time to Python and separating the different use cases. In this case, we're going to use Flask. And now, this is a very important question because now it's asking us, okay, do you want to include additional Docker Compose files? It's kind of a generic question, But what it's actually asking, do we want to include debug into our compose files? And absolutely we do, because it's such a nice feature, which we'll cover later. Next, we want to discover what application we're running. And in this case, you can see app.py, app.py. It matches, so we're good to go. And finally, what port are we going to use? And we're using port 5000. Boom, there you go. That quick Docker extension then created a Docker file for us. You can see it's using Alpine, it's exposing port 5000, it's adding our application into the container, using app user, so it's not using a root user, and then the command to actually start our application. Additionally, it also created a Docker compose file, a Docker debug file, a Docker ignore file, so now we're not committing certain settings or certain local things that we don't want to push up to Git, so by default we're not pushing in the VS Code information up or prior VS Code. That means, for example, when I do a Docker build, we can look in here, here's Docker build, and this is exactly how the Docker build command works within the application. I can actually change this to a different tag, say my tag, and that means every time I run the build command, it tags it as my tag. Or I can actually adjust how the debug works. So when the debug command runs, I can turn off no debugger or add different flags. It's all completely customizable, which is really brilliant. Additionally, you have the launch command. So what happens when we launch Python Flask? And it says, okay, we're actually going to local root, remote root, and it's going to launch our application into the debug phase. Now, all this comes for free. I mean, you just do the command palette, Docker, add files, and it's up and running. Now let's see this in action because, okay, I didn't make any changes to this, but we are going to go and we're going to start this compose file just to make sure that it actually does what it's supposed to do. So Docker compose up, and now it asks us which compose file we want to use, which is kind of handy, right? If we want to do debug or just a normal compose. In this case, we'll do a normal compose. And now you can see it's building the application. It is done. And if we head back over to our extension, you should see, there it is. Our Python project has started. So now if we can actually click here and open in browser. It opens in a different screen, of course. And there's our cat GIF generator. So we can then refresh, and we are just full of cats. This is really awesome. Well, let's stop that Python project, and I'll show you a different way we can actually start that as well. If we go back to the compose files, you can actually right-click directly on the compose file and restart, or stop the compose stack. So I'm going to restart it again directly from here. Right-click, up, and there you go. I am up again. I go back to my Docker extension, a refresh. There you go, and we're back in action. Open the browser, and voila, we should have cats coming up. There we go. So there's our cat browser, showing you two different ways you can launch it, and we will take you into the next step, because this is all building into how we can then debug and then run with context and write Docker files all within Visual Studio Code without leaving Visual Studio Code. This is just great. In this next section, we're going to learn how to write Docker files with Visual Studio Code with command completion. First, when we're writing a Docker file, you write from and then the image name. But we can actually use Visual Studio Code to look up the images directly from Visual Studio Code by doing Control plus space as we're typing the image name. Next, we can do command completion. So as we're typing a command, it actually gives you suggestions. For example, here, command executable. So it gives you the format of the command. If you still have questions, it actually links to the Docker documentation as well, so you can get further reference. Let's take a closer look in the demo and write some Docker files with the command completion. All right, we're heading back over to my desktop where Visual Studio Code is still running the same Python project we had previous. But now we're going to write a Docker file using command completion as well as querying Docker Hub for the proper image and tag. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it Docker. And you see instantly Visual Studio Code recognizes this folder as a Docker maybe content going to be in this folder. Surprising, right? Next, we're going to add Dockerfile inside this folder, and you can see right away Visual Studio Code recognizes it as a Dockerfile and will enable Dockerfile syntax checking automatically, auto-magically. All right, first thing in a Dockerfile is the from line. So instantly you can see from baseline, and if I just type tab, it fills it in. But what if I want a different image? And you see it gives me a bit of context down below, if I want to add more. If I click to the right, it actually shows me the different possibilities with images and how to reference. So it provides a lot of information. Now, what I want to do is I want to type Alpine, but maybe I don't know how to spell it or the proper image. So I can go Control Space now, and it's going to show me all the Docker Alpine images that are available in Docker Hub. And there's quite some. I'm going to take the first one. As you see, it's the official. As you see here, it's the official Alpine image. So go ahead and hit Enter. Now let's look up the tag. Go double point. Again, Control Space. Here's all the tags. Oh, 3.11. That works perfect. Let's take that one. And now let's do the run command. So run apk add, no cache, MySQL client. Then we have the command that actually executes the executable. But how do I do that again? cm Control Space. Oh, that's how I do it. So you can see the command executable, that's the format. Over here to the right, you can see more information, how the actual documentation works. And if I wanted, I can go directly out to Docker documentation to find out more. But in this case, we're just going to autocomplete, then we're going to type in MySQL, and there you go. I've quickly wrote a Docker file with autocompletion and querying Docker Hub for the proper image name and tag. Just like that. It's super easy. It works the same in Docker Compose as well. Let's head back over to the slides. All right, in the next section, we're going to build and debug Compose and Dockerfiles. If you remember back to the bootstrap section, we actually bootstrapped Docker with Dockerfiles and Compose files, and we selected yes to include debug. So now we have this capability built in that we can debug our application directly within Visual Studio Code. And as you see, there's an icon on the left-hand side, this little triangle with a little bug on it, and that's the debug screen. And in here, we can actually execute the debug. So it starts up the container in debug mode and gives you a little bit more verbose output, and we can start interacting with it. Additionally, we can add a breakpoint directly into our code to tell Visual Studio Code debugger to stop at this point, stop running the application at this point, so we can further analyze what's going on. And you see on the left-hand side, it actually outputs all the variables and what it's actually trying to achieve in this application. We can also watch certain variables and see if they're being executed correctly. Now in the demo, we're actually going to debug our app. We're going to break it, and then we're going to debug it and fix it within debug. Let's have a look. All right, let's pop back over to Visual Studio Code, and this time it's kind of counterintuitive, but we're going to break our application. Usually I'm spending most of my time the other way trying to fix bugs, but we're going to introduce a bug into our app.py application, so our cat GIF generator. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this variable images with an extra S, and this should just completely break my application. Now that we change it, we can actually start debug. And if you remember back when we bootstrapped the application, we selected additional Docker Compose and debug capability. So it added all these debug commands by default into our command. You see, we're not adding anything additional to the Docker container or Compose or anything of that sort. And basically, it's just enabled once we bootstrap an application. Now, I'm going to run the debug. I know our images variable is not working for whatever reason. But let's run debug first and see what happens. What happens is it builds a Docker file, it launches the application to see what happens. So there you go, internal server area, oh no, is not good. We're not happy now, right? So let's go back and add some more debug to our application. So we know images is not working correctly. So we want to watch that variable because it's not being populated. And we want to add a breakpoint. Remember, the breakpoint tells Visual Studio Code Debugger to stop at this point and then kind of echo out all the details regarding our application up to this point. So let's disconnect, refresh our debug. Let's execute the debugger again. And there it goes. And this time it stops at the breakpoint. It builds the Docker container again. And now you can see we get all the variables from the application before it breaks. And now, if I expand this a bit, you can see images is not defined, unknown error, images is not defined, etc. So image is not defined, image is not defined. So I'd venture to say my images is not defined. Let's go back and fix this. So we save it, we refresh our debug, let's launch the debugger again. It's building the application once again, and again it's going to stop at this breakpoint. And this time you see, oh, the images are there again. It actually shows me the list of images available. So it should be working. So let's remove the breakpoint this time. Let's refresh again. Let's execute the debugger once again and see what happens. See if we fix our application. And it's starting, building container, and there we go. We have our cat GIF generator running once again. So we successfully troubleshot our application. We debugged it. And now we have cats galore. And again, we didn't have to add any extra code to our application, to the Docker file, to be able to debug. How cool is that? I mean, that's really like power user stuff right there. All right, let's jump back to the presentation and take a look at context. All right, luckily we were able to fix our application with debug, so we can head on to the next section, which is connect to Docker hosts. And what that means is using Docker context command to allow us to connect Visual Studio Code to various Docker hosts. Local, in the cloud, Docker and Docker, you have multiple possibilities. So how do we do that? Within the Docker extension, you can actually switch to other Docker hosts. So at the very bottom, you see context. You can actually right-click on, for example, default and say use, and it switches Visual Studio to use that particular Docker instance. And then you see all the containers, you see all the images, all the registries, everything from this particular context. If I switch to Docker and Docker, again, it changes the context. I only see the images and containers from Docker and Docker. So it allows me to have multiple instances and also think about it from a point of view of, having multiple servers that you can maintain from a single interface. You don't have to SSH anymore. You can just change context and be connected to your server. It's quite simple, it's very powerful, and then you have the same functionality in the same screen without having to jump around as you previously did. Let's take a look at how Docker context works within Visual Studio Code. All right, in this next demo, we're going to switch back to Visual Studio Code, and we're going to click on our Docker extension, which opens up our Docker extension UI. Here, at the very bottom of the UI, you see context, and right now, in all the demos, we've been using our default context, which is my local Docker desktop interface. Now, if I want to, I can actually switch to a different host. So I have Docker and Docker running as well. And what I'm going to do, and this is Brian's Docker, which is a cloud server running, but I'm going to connect to Docker and Docker. So that's actually a container running on my machine, and I'm going to connect to the socket running on that. So we right-click on it, we click Use, and you can see right away there's one container running. There's a hello world that stopped. Here's the images. So now I'm directly interfacing to this host as it's like on my local machine. So I can actually jump in and say view logs. I can see the logs of the HTTP server. I can inspect. I can do everything that I did previously, but now I'm doing it in a remote context. The power of context is now I can connect to multiple servers using the same Docker extension interface, which allows me to, streamline my workflow as connecting to different servers, and just helps tremendously. But now I can interact with this. I can then switch back to my normal context. And again, you can see there's all my containers. I have tons of images here. And you can easily jump back and forth. You can see it's very powerful, it's very useful, so now I don't have to open up the SSH window to jump into another Docker host. I don't have to RDP somewhere. I do everything from Visual Studio Code. Great tool. Give it a try. Docker Context. And now we're to the recap of this session. I really hope that everyone was able to take some bits away that can really enable their workflows, be a little bit more efficient. And now with Visual Studio Code and the Docker extension, you can actually be a power user, right? You can be the hero of your office. Let's quickly look at what we covered in this session. First off is the Docker extension user interface. With this user interface, we can actually do multiple selects. We can right-click on Docker Compose files and start and stop them directly there. We can interact with the different containers, volumes, networks, registries, the context, etc. And we can actually right-click and check logs, right-click and inspect. We can do a lot of things. The next thing we learned was the Docker extension command palette. With the command palette, we can actually interface with the Docker extension through Visual Studio Code, which allows us to do a little bit more. For example, adding files to the Docker. And next, we went through the different demos of bootstrapping a vanilla application, so no Dockerfile, no Compose file. We interacted with it. We wrote some Docker Compose files. We debugged, and we connected to multiple hosts using Docker Context. What we also learned is there's tons of shortcuts, and there's a lot more we didn't even cover in this session because there's just not enough time. There's tons and tons and tons. And this brings me to the next point is read the documentation. I really missed this point when I first installed the extension a long time ago, and I really thought it was just for like command completion and syntax checking. But after some time, I realized that there's so much more to this extension, and I hope everyone now realizes that this extension can really improve and make you more efficient. So again, you're going to be the power user in your office. Next up is resources. The first thing is the documentation. Microsoft did an excellent job. It's open source documentation, so if you find anything wrong, please contribute, add a change, and get it fixed. The next thing is, if you're familiar with awesome lists, Visual Studio Code also has its own awesome list, and there you can find information, tips and tricks, as well as, certain extensions and things that play well with programming languages. It's really a great resource. And the final thing, Visual Studio Code and the Docker extension are both open source. So I really recommend that everyone goes and looks at the open source repo and maybe contribute if you can. And that's all for this session. Thank you very much. Again, my name is Brian Christner. You can find me on Twitter at IDoMyOwnTricks. I'm always answering tweets or emails or direct messages, so please send me if you have any questions, and I look forward to talking to everyone in the Q&A. Thank you.